Thanks for tuning in for one of our Sunday messages. At Red, we're continuing to lean into our vision of being a church of passionate and committed disciples who are devoted to Jesus' alternative for the world. If you're inspired or encouraged by the ministry of our church, we'd love to have you join us. You can find out more at redchurch.au.
Great to be here this morning. My name's Mark, and I'm going to be bringing God's Word today, this Easter Resurrection Sunday. Particularly welcome to you if this is your first time in church. Already reports in across Australia in different Good Friday, Palm Sunday, different services, record amounts of people turning up for the first time. That's not just happening in Oz, happening all over the place. So you are in good company. What we are celebrating today is Resurrection Sunday. Many of you were at the two services we held over Good Friday. And on Good Friday, we remember the story of Jesus' death upon the cross, where he paid a price that he did not have to pay, the price for our rebellion and sin, and upon the cross, breathed his last and said, "It is finished," because the work upon the cross was done. And then this silence, this quietness for a couple of days. The disciples, many of the people who are following Jesus, the crowds have disappeared. Even some of the key disciples have disappeared. There is just really a few women and a couple of disciples who have stuck around. But really, it looks like the whole story, the project, this narrative, this good news is over. And then what you get, breaking the silence at dawn, and I went out, it was quiet this morning with a red sky as the sun came up, and it's very quiet, particularly in the holidays here, but it would have been quiet that morning in Jerusalem. But if you can just imagine having a sound effects mic of what the sound effects of the resurrection must have been like, the sound of surprise from Mary as she encounters the risen Jesus, mistaking him for a gardener, the hurried, excited talk between the disciples as people run into houses saying, "The tomb is empty, he has risen." And this doesn't just happen on Resurrection Sunday. What happens there then is spread in conversation, but not just conversation. It's actually Jesus turning up and appearing in places, the risen Jesus, as he said he would. And so the quiet, reflective silence of Good Friday and the silence of Saturday begins to turn into an excited hubbub. That's a word you haven't probably used for a while. As people talk to each other and the news begins to spread. So what I want to read from for our reading for Resurrection Sunday is actually the story of one of the disciples and his encounter with this hubbub. For him, it remains a hubbub. It's just talk at this stage. But this is the intersection between the noise register going up and the intersection with what is going on in his life. So let's actually stand and read together. I'm pretty sure we've got it. Great. We're going to read from John's Gospel 20 to 24, chapter 20, verses 24 to 29. You're going to read it. I'm simply going to start it by saying the word now. And then in big Resurrection Sunday voices, we're going to read this. And if you've not been in church before and you're wondering what Thomas's other name is, it's Didymus. So have fun saying that. Okay, so now. Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." And he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." A week later, the disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here, see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Grab a seat. Amen. If you were here on Good Friday, or if you weren't, what I spoke about was this journey that Jesus makes on Good Friday over a horizon that humans cannot travel over. The one thing that all of the different great civilizations and kings and queens could not get past was actually the event horizon line of death. That this was the one thing that continually came to humans that no one could conquer. And you could argue, like Becker, the philosopher, said, that so much of human culture is actually this battle to deny death. So many things that we do is to prove that almost we can be immortal, that we can get past death. Cain, who killed his brother in this cascading series of falls that comes from the rebellion of Adam and Eve, he sets up this city, and this city in many ways is a denial of death set against the dwelling place, the home that God had created for human beings to be with God in Eden. And so much of human activity is this denial of our mortality. I think I shared maybe in the second service, I can't remember, on Good Friday, the statistics that has recently come out of Australia. Trudy and I got to go to a presentation with a small group of leaders that's now been publicly released last week of some data that's a subset of data that's come from the Australian census. And what the Australian census is saying is that around 750,000 Australians in the last census went from no religion to Christian. And they're going to tell us who this demographic cohort was. I'm thinking because what we're seeing, say, in places like the UK, where amongst Gen Z, they're twice as likely to be religious as their parents. There's this huge uptick we're seeing in lots of places where the young are coming to faith just in the last 2 years in dramatic ways. And what I expected was them to say it's going to be young people. But actually what they said in Australia, the main representation in that group, who are people who are coming to faith, is the over 55s. There's some shock there. I was a bit like that. There was a number of things that were quite surprising in some of the data. I'm talking to Mark McCrindle, who put this together. We were chatting to why is this happening? And my reflections are, and I think what is happening is Australia. There's a thing called the Australian dream. And the Australian dream is, it's not just, the house and the backyard and the dog and the hills hoist. It's now this life which is incredibly comfortable, and life in Australia can be pretty good. But often what happens beginning around 55, the very real reality of your mortality starts to kick in. And all of a sudden Australia and what it can provide doesn't have an answer for what is over the event horizon of death. And so I talked about on Good Friday is the fact that Jesus on the cross goes where no human could go, where human culture fears, and goes through death. And not just goes through death, but conquers death. Because sin had brought death into the world. So Jesus goes over that event horizon of death and dies. And so God, who created this home for us to live with him, and we rebelled against that, went into exile, always facing death and the consequences of sin. Jesus pays this price on the cross and defeats death and defeats sin. And I talked about this deep longing that humans have. There's these two almost drives. One is the drive of the fear of death, but then there's this other drive that there must be something more. They're longing for something beyond this world, this home that is over the horizon. There's notions of home that we have here, but there's a sense that the change is always happening, and the full family home one day may become empty as it's sold on and knocked down for developers or whatever. There's this constancy that whatever human versions of home we create, there's a limited time span on that. And this deep desire for something bigger, something greater, something no earthly longing can satisfy. So on Good Friday, we talked about the fact that Jesus goes straight towards what we fear and conquers it. And then he goes to this place the Father has created for us, the house of God, where there are many rooms. And he prepares a place for those who love him. So that's incredibly good news. But what we encounter on Resurrection Sunday is that the news intensifies. And after the plot shift of Jesus heading straight towards death, dying, going over the horizon, going ahead to prepare a place for those who love him to be with God for eternity, there's another plot shift. There's a vibe shift after the vibe shift. And so Jesus rises on the third day, and his rising isn't just this little event that happens in a little tomb in Jerusalem, that this is like a new creation. I think we've got the text up here, but in John 20, verse 1, and also verses 14 to 16, it says, early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark. Resurrection power comes when it's dark. Dawn breaks when it's dark. If you're looking at the world and thinking it's dark, that's the exact moment that resurrection power breaks out. Mary Magdalene went to the tomb. This woman who, Scripture tells us, had been possessed, oppressed by demonic forces that had ruined her life. Her life was one of constant harassment and oppression by things she could not control, things that were on the spiritual dark side. And she meets Jesus, and Jesus changes her life. And then she becomes one of the financial givers that helped Jesus' ministry, one of the leaders in the early church. This woman, who according to a court of law, her testimony could not even be submitted because as a woman she was seen as too lowly and with no social standing. Yet the irony of the gospel is that she then is the first witness. The disciples go from being disciples following the way of Jesus to being apostles, sent ones in the Greek, and here is Mary. She meets Jesus, and then she is off like a rocket, sent on a mission to tell people that after the plot shift, there's another plot shift. And so what happens is she turned towards him and cried out in Aramaic, Rabboni, which means teacher. The tomb is now empty, which means death and decay are now vacant and empty. This is a sign, if death has been defeated, this is a sign that life wins. This is a sign of new creation, new possibilities, new direction. A new story is breaking in the world. And this new creation, it's not tame. It's not passive. It's not moderate. This new creation breaking out into the world is disruptive. And it doesn't just disrupt once 2,000 years ago, it keeps breaking in unexpectedly. And so God, incarnated, Jesus, goes to the other side of death, to the Father's house, which is being prepared with many rooms for us. But now he's breaking back into the world through the resurrection. God is breaking into our home, the world. There was cherubim put at the gate of the Garden of Eden so we could not enter. And Jesus at this point, through his work on the cross, is breaking down that gate, and he is coming like the father who sees the prodigal son running towards us. And this is what the story of Thomas is about. In John 20, verse 19, it says, on the evening of that first day of that week, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. There are plenty of moments in the Gospels where we see the patterns of spirituality of Jesus. There's the crowds where he's doing ministry and he's healing the sick and he's casting out demons and he's teaching them the ways of God. And then you see this pattern of reflection where he then goes to a quiet place and he sits and he prays and thinks to God and he spends time with the Father. And so much of the Christian life is the busyness often of doing ministry and then this retreat of reflection and silence. This is something different. When Jesus appears, who they have seen on the cross die, and you're having a conversation and you're in a room which is most likely locked, and then Jesus appears and hi guys, this is not normal. This is not something you go, let me just get my journal, put some ambient worship music on, and I just need to go in the other room and reflect on what this could mean for me at this stage of my life journey. This is like the risen Jesus appears in your midst, a guy who was died, put in a tomb, and then he arrives in this moment. This is disruptive. This is new life, new creation breaking out and saying, hello, here I am. He walks through walls, not to impress, but to interrupt fear, isolation, and uncertainty. The king who once departed has returned, and he comes right into the middle of their fear, doubt, and closed off hearts. Jesus, like a holy burglar, breaks in to bring peace and presence despite all of the little mind games the disciples have got going on in their head in what they thought was meant to happen. The king has returned, and he does not respect your locked door. Now, what I love is that Thomas is in many ways like the hero. He's like an anti-hero hero. He's a main character in this moment where he is experiencing this, and you see the emotions of someone who has followed Jesus, thought it was going in this direction, but then it actually goes in this direction because the risen Jesus is now amongst them. And I want to just read from that. We've got a painting. I had a painting yesterday. We're going back to art school. I've got another painting. This is a painting by Caravaggio, the painter. This was done in 1602. And Caravaggio's painting are massive. They're like heavy metal. They're huge. There's lots of blackness in the back, this technique called chiaroscuro, where it's like light and dark. And here is a picture of Thomas, what you just read out, and Thomas is putting his finger into Jesus' wounds. And you've got the other guys looking behind, the other disciples peering on. Now, often when this story has told, it's told in this particular way. Thomas had his doubts. He didn't really believe. He hears about the resurrection and is like, doesn't really happen. And then Jesus appears, and Jesus shows him his wounds in his hands, and Thomas sees them and sees, I didn't believe. Now you've given me the empirical proof. Now I believe. And part of the problem is because we are 21st century people who are in an Enlightenment world, the Enlightenment or post-Enlightenment world. The Enlightenment world was a world where people said, you can only believe what you see and what goes according to the scientific method. It's gotten a lot more complex since then. Science is a lot more complex. I'm not going to do a whole talk on that now. This is not the time nor place. But what is going on here is that Thomas is not someone who is just wondering whether this was a scientific fact. Is this a miracle or is it not? Is this natural or supernatural? These actual categories would not have been in his worldview, nor of anyone around them. Thomas doesn't doubt whether a supernatural event happened. He doubts that it could have happened this way. His worldview expected a Messiah who would conquer, not suffer. The cross had shattered those expectations. The book of Deuteronomy said anyone who dies on a tree is actually under a curse, unclean. That's how the rabbis interpreted crucifixion. Now, what's interesting is what is going on here is not so much that Thomas is like some 21st century person. It's like, I'll believe in Jesus when you give me, a video replay of the resurrection from Sunday. Actually, what is going on here is that the resurrection of Jesus has run up against Thomas's expectations. Thomas has his own house that he has built of expectations. I remember being in, I think it was year 10, art, maybe year 11. I stayed down in year 11, so it's a bit blurry. Did it twice. They thought I was so good they wanted me to come back. And I remember, we were doing some painting, and I remember someone on my right, she said, "Here's my painting." And it was not great. And it was one of those people, it just was doing art because they sort of had to. And they painted this painting, and it was a painting of a house. And I don't know, she was 15, 16 or something, 17, I don't know, around there. And it was a house with a white picket fence. It was a nice little cottage with a couple of trees. And she had a date on it. And I said, "What's the date?" And she said, "That's the date I will get married. And this is the house I will live in." I was like, okay. I did have a little speculation as to whether she was hinting something, but that's again for another Sunday. I got a few weird art class stories, but again, not for this Sunday. Now, what she was doing, rudimentary, it was a teenage girl, and this is what she was expecting her life to head out to be. But in a sense, we all do this. We construct these inner houses, these homes, these visions they generate when we're young of what life should be like, of where things should go, of what our expectations are. And we can also fit God into this kind of framework. And hers had a white picket fence and the date she thought she'd get married and what it would look like and the expectations around that. You and I all have our own versions of this. Thomas had built such a house. He had this framework of what he thought the Messiah should do. And the cross had reduced that house of expectations to rubble. But what happens now is that Jesus begins to disrupt the pulling down of those expectations. The other interesting thing about the statistics that Trudy and I went and heard is the most committed and regular church-going generation in Australia is not who I thought it would be. The most regular and church-going generation in Australia, I thought, would be the baby boomers. Sorry, baby boomers, you are the least committed generation in the Australian church. These are just statistics, not you. Not the ones in this room. You're in church, you're doing fantastically. There's always a remnant in every generation. The most dedicated and committed generation, and if this is your generation, you can give it a cheer, is millennials. Who expected that? Cultural scripts shaping your mind. Second most committed generation, Gen Z. I know. And as Lindy Plunkett, she's not here, as a Gen Xer said, why are Gen X always forgotten? Exactly. Now, basically what's happening in Australia is that under 45, culture Christianity is dead. Like, you do not go to church unless you really mean it. That's why 75% roughly of millennials and 68% of Gen Z, if you say you're a Christian, you're coming. And I think part of the reason that we're seeing this turn to faith, particularly amongst the young, but also I talked about the old as the mortality reality comes, is that the world that many people have been promised in Australia, particularly millennials, is actually not eventuating. The painting of the house that we were given by society is not eventuating. And there's a growing group of people who are then saying, hang on, I need to see a bigger answer than just what the secular world's giving me, what the entertainment world's giving me, what the internet is giving me, but actually need to look to Jesus. And what I want to say today is that you may be someone who's feeling that the painting you had of what the house that you thought you would live in is not matching up to reality. Is that actually what Jesus does is that actually comes in and disrupts this, but he's building something better. Now, going back to Caravaggio, What I find fascinating about this painting, and I remember looking at this in pictures when I was younger, is I always thought it was about the hands. Here's the wounds in my hands. Here's the proof. But Jesus actually gets Thomas to do something. He actually invites him, and it's a weird invitation. There is invitations from Jesus to come follow him. This is one of the more unusual ones. Only Thomas gets this. And it's literally like, put your hand into my side. When we were doing ministry in the city, Trinity and I used to do ministry with the Salvation Army. There was a guy who had who came, as sort of lived around the city, and he had a large festering wound. And he loved to show people the festering wound on his neck. And so he'd have to have this thing where you had to manage him when you have new people rock up. And it's wonderful to be greeted in church. Hopefully you've been greeted today. And but it's not as good to say, oh, hi, welcome. Here's my massive festering wound. Now, wounds are not nice. There is something that is off-putting about them. But actually, Jesus says to Thomas, he's disrupting his house of expectation that he's built. And he does this when he says, put your hand into my side. And you can see this clearly. Caravaggio, and he's just brilliant at capturing the human form and flesh and body. You see Thomas, and he's meditating, he's thinking, he's sort of like fearful as he's doing it, concentrated face as he's putting his finger into Jesus' side. Why the side? What is the symbolism of the side? Well, number one, it shows that the Messiah did die. Thomas thought that the Messiah would not die. That was not what was supposed to happen. The Messiah was meant to rock in, kick out the Romans, and establish a new Davidic kingdom, and the disciples were hoping that they were going to be the cabinet, the guys who were close to the big guy, Jesus. But the Messiah dies. This is totally different than what they were expecting. And it tells us in John 19, verse 34, that one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. This side is the wound of death. Resurrection doesn't erase the suffering. Jesus still has scars, but it transforms it. Now, I'm just going to repeat that because that could be an entire sermon in itself. Resurrection doesn't erase the suffering. The resurrected Jesus still has wounds in his hands and a hole in his side, but it transforms the suffering. The second thing is that it fulfills this vision of Jesus as Adam. Adam, we see in Genesis, Eve comes from the side. There's a rib taken out of Adam's side, and then he's given this companion, Eve, who comes from that rib. And what this is saying now is there's another kind of Genesis moment, a new birth happening here. Jesus is the second Adam, undoing what the first Adam did wrong. And actually what is being birthed is a companion for Jesus, but the companion for Jesus is the church, the bride of Christ, birthed from the side of the new Adam. The early church fathers saw this. John Chrysostom, one of the great early church theologians, says, as God took a rib from Adam's side to fashion a woman, so Christ has given us blood and water from his side to fashion the church. But I think what captures me the most of why Jesus invites Thomas to put his hand in the side, this seemingly strange thing, is that it's an invitation to intimacy. To get that close, to touch his wounds, is actually to enter into an intimacy with Jesus. This is union. This is communion. This is him actually touching the resurrection, transforming new life of Jesus. You see, the side of Christ, which the Roman soldiers had speared in order to kill him, is now transformed in this moment into something where those can enter into new life. Death is turned on its head. It becomes a place of new life. And at this moment, Thomas's expectations, the house that he'd built, falls. But something more incredible replaces it. Jesus becomes his new dwelling place. Now, we don't know 100% the story of what happens to Thomas, but Church history tells us that most likely he then became one of the apostles, a missionary. Many people think that he ended up in India. There are some churches in India which still speak elements of their liturgy in Aramaic. It's very possible that Thomas was part of that community that then goes and brings the gospel to India. And some of you in this room, that may be your spiritual ancestry and history because of the invitation to touch the side. In Matthew 7:24-27, Jesus tells a parable of two houses. He says, but everyone hears the words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. Thomas had built a house on sand, but now he's found his rock. And so this image of houses being disrupted, of individual houses that people had created, literal houses being disrupted by the resurrection, continues. We're going to celebrate Pentecost in a little bit, but I just want to just telegraph it. What happens on Pentecost in Acts 2, verses 1-2, is Jesus, as he ascends, tells the disciples and the small Jesus community, wait until power comes upon you. It says this, when the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly, like the blowing of a violent wind came and filled the whole house where they were sitting. Just as God had once filled the tabernacle and the temple with his glory, he now fills an ordinary house in Jerusalem. Now, the church is the house that he is filling. Jesus said in John 14:23, anyone who loves me will obey my teaching. My Father will love them, and we will come to them and make our home with them. In Ephesians 2, verses 19-22, it says this about this community, which is birthed from the side of Christ. You are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people and members of his household. In him, the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple in the Lord. And in him too, you are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit. We now are the home where heaven lives on earth, and we wait for Jesus' return. Resurrection power doesn't just live in a tomb, it lives in us. We house it when Jesus lives in us. We live at this moment where so many of the houses that have been constructed are being exposed as being built on sand. It is unparalleled to see this reality over different spheres: technology, politics, economics, individual relationships, family, culture. I could go on all day. We live at a moment when more and more people are realizing that they've been sold a bad development, a shonky house, buildings that just is not fit for purpose, which wouldn't pass inspection. Some of us, I think all of us, if we're really honest, have also built houses of expectation which are our own, which we cling to even as they're being buffeted by the storms of this day. But what I want to remind you of at this moment is that in the darkest times, in the darkness of that dawn, that is when the light of the resurrection breaks through. And Mary's heart is so soft. Mary, who doesn't have anything else, she's there in the tomb, or near the tomb, and she is honoring Jesus. So some of you are in that place. You've been close to Jesus and you honor him and you're blessed and remembered this Resurrection Sunday of how much he loves you. When he says Mary's name, it's this personal, intimate greeting. But others of us have our own houses of expectation which are being shaken in this moment. I think where we are going from this point, that fact that I shared with you, that under 45, if you're in church, you really believe it. This is now the mode of the church going forward. What you're going to see is people who are either 100% for it or not for it at all. And the rising generations that are coming up are wanting to see not just leaders or churches, but Christians who are 100% for God. We just heard a story back this week of someone who'd visited Red, gone back to their country where they're from and gone to a church there and heard the story of Christians who had lost their lives because they 100% believed this. Just literally in Palm Sunday, just recently, as we were worshiping here in Ukraine, missile hits the church as people are going to Palm Sunday. Good Friday in Nigeria, people killed for their faith. These people are not on some distant planet. These are our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, people who are sacrificing everything, who are living for God. And I think where the direction of the world is going, I cannot tell you that it's going to get better. But what I can preach is the message of the one true King who beat death, who's building a house, who will appear in your house when you pray and ask his presence to come in. He is wanting to appear where there is a house of anxiety and say, peace with you. He's not just calming nerves, he's bringing heaven home. Will we allow our houses of expectation to fall and let Jesus be our home? Will we say like Thomas, and you think Thomas, the moment when he touches that side, it's like his eyes are open, and that's the moment when he proclaims, my Lord and my God. So what I would love to do is this. We're going to end now. And I'm actually going to put a request to the worship band. Oh, hello, Melody. I'll let you get ready, sorry. Melody's there. We're going to get the worship band to come up. I'm going to get you to stand. On Good Friday, we took communion, and we took it in a way where we looked forward to the coming house that God has built for us, where we'll live with him in eternity. And it was reflective. There's a solemnity to Good Friday. We remember Jesus' death. We go through the story where we sit for a bit in the pain and the loss. But this is actually Resurrection Sunday. So this is a completely different mood. As I said, the sound is not quiet and silence and sobbing in the background as it would have been as Jesus' body was taken down from the cross, as it was placed by Joseph of Arimathea into a tomb. It's not the silence of Saturday where people would have gone back to their homes and thought that the whole story was over. What actually happens at this moment as Jesus begins to turn up, he begins to again be with his disciples. He even eats with them on the beach. So let's actually now, in a different form of taking communion, where we take of the bread, which reminds us of Jesus' body given for us, the very body that still had scars and a spear wound in the side. We take that into us. We say yes to Jesus' life. We take of the blood, which is spilt on the cross. But let's actually do this in a different mode than we did it on Good Friday. Let's actually do this in a sense of victory. And I'm going to invite you into a mode that you've probably not maybe ever done. I'm going to ask you to be triumphant. When's the last time you said, last Saturday I was very triumphant? Maybe your football team won. That's probably about the only time it would ever happen. But we're actually going to take this in a sense of victory and triumphant. So I'm actually going to ask the band to... I know nothing about music. I'm not good at music. But I'm going to ask you to be triumphant in your playing of worship. And we're going to sing. So we're going to take communion. We're not going to have the quiet time. We're actually going to sing together and worship. And at the end of the age is this image. When Jesus returns and comes back to the earth, he makes his home and the people sing. The heavenly choir sings. Jesus is coming back. He's going to make his home on earth. He's appearing in homes. He's disrupting our world. So we're now going to move into a time of victorious, triumphant, glorious singing. So I'm going to hand it to the band now. When you're ready, how we do it, Red, we have some at the front here, up the back. When you're ready, let's move forward into a triumphant taking of communion.